So anyway, now can you hear me? Yes, thanks. So I'm starting mine. There is a bit of a crossover with Wayne's presentation, but I'm actually starting mine in 1952 with the British. ANZUS has already been created in 1951 between Australia, New Zealand and the United States. And the British position on this is that Churchill's quite disturbed by ANZUS planning in the Pacific. For the British, they of course still have Pacific Island possessions. They also have Hong Kong, they have Malaya, and Singapore. Singapore is strategically extremely important for the British. They have their main base in the Singapore base, which they had returned to after the Second World War, and they had responsibility for the protection of Malaya. Malaya's back being a British colony immediately after the Second World War, and they feel excluded. The British feel excluded from planning that affects British territories with this creation of ANZUS. The US, on the other hand, doesn't want the British to be involved in ANZUS. They're concerned that if they draw the British into ANZUS, that the French will also demand equal treatment. And that's one of the reasons they're certainly not interested in expanding out to the French, even though by this stage they are financially supporting the French role in battle against the Viet Minh in Vietnam. The United States are actually bankrolling the French in their military campaign in the First Indochina War. They're still very sensitive about being drawn into Southeast Asian security commitments, hence the fact that they're bankrolling the French and they're not actually getting involved. In 1954, the French make an appeal to the Americans to become involved in their war against the Viet Minh, but the British are very much against themselves being involved in Indochina, so are the Americans. But the big thing for the Americans is that any expansion of ANZUS would then expect the United States commitments to Hong Kong, Indochina and Malaya. And so by keeping the French and the British out of any sort of joint security apparatus, it limits the United States being drawn into having to protect these colonial possessions that the French and the British have. They're also concerned about communist propaganda. And the United States at this time in the early 1960s, 50s, are very concerned about this impression of neo-colonialism and this idea of Western powers dominating. And I've got a quote here, this is a quote from US documents saying, concerned about Western powers dominating the East. And so this is their position on not wanting to keep the British they're very much out of ANZUS. Australia and New Zealand's position at this time, when Churchill's sounding a bit peeved about not wanting to be involved, is that in particular the New Zealanders start to become concerned about pressure from the British over ANZUS. Menzies himself backs the United States position, and he feels that it is unwise for Britain to join ANZUS. Menzies' hope at this time is that a five-power liaison group, which has also been set up, that does include the British and the French, it's Britain, France, the United States, Australia and New Zealand. This five-power liaison group for Southeast Asia defence would give Britain a satisfactory substitute to not being part of ANZUS. And Menzies and Holland is the New Zealand Prime Minister at the time, they suggest to Churchill that a relationship between ANZUS and ANZAM be established. And I have to thank Wayne for raising the subject of ANZAM, so I don't need to explain what that is, but it's very much about the sphere of influence in the security sphere of influence in the area of Malaya and Australia and New Zealand. And by elevating a relationship between ANZUS and ANZAM, ANZUS then keeps the British, ANZUS keeps the British fully informed. And so then this becomes a de facto relationship where the British can actually be part of ANZUS conversations, but not actually be a member of ANZUS, which of course the Americans are very much opposed to. And so Menzies, it's suggested by Menzies that the process goes along in 3 stages. The first stage is that they strengthen ANZAM, and there's the similar map that Wayne had on his slides of the ANZAM strategic area. Then it moves on to a liaison system at a high level between ANZUS and ANZAM. And Menzies, it's a quote I have from a conversation that Menzies had with the Americans, which is that the planning performed separately by ANZUS and ANZAM organisations should fall within the hands of a joint ANZUS-ANZAM committee. And so, as I said, this is the way that Menzies is seeing as a way to include the British without actually putting the Americans offside over the American position on British exclusion from the ANZUS organisation. It's then, however, by 1954, we see the beginning of the SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organisation. And so this idea of bringing, elevating ANZAM along with ANZUS is sort of overtaken by the beginning of SEATO, which of course Britain becomes a member of SEATO along with Australia, New Zealand, the United States, France, and also Pakistan, Thailand, and the Philippines. And SEATO it had its origins for the discussions about the creation of SEATO happened during the Geneva conferences on Indochina, and it started with Anglo-American conversations over the creation of a security apparatus for Southeast Asia. It was hastily put together. The Americans were adamant that the finalisation of SEATO, the agreement would happen before the final Geneva agreements were signed at the Geneva conferences. So there was quite a lot of haste on the behalf of the Americans, which didn't really put SEATO off on a very good footing because SEATO hastily gathered together. Only 2 Southeast Asian nations, countries were members of SEATO, and there were a number of compromises. The British actually wanted SEATO to be a wider organisation than what it actually turned out to be. And SEATO didn't produce what the Australians had wanted out of SEATO, which was access to American military planning. And on March 1955, Australia believed an agreement on military planning between ANZUS and the UK could be used under the cover of SEATO. They'd moved on from this idea of having elevating AUKUS with ANZAM, and they thought that they could actually use SEATO as a cover for having 4-power talks between the United States, Australia, Britain, and New Zealand. The United States is not very keen about this. They don't agree with it because they're concerned that any sort of 4-power internal conversations between the 4 English-speaking members of SEATO would extract force commitments to Malaya, US force commitments to Malaya, and they were also very much concerned about the Asian members of SEATO. They were concerned that this would look like there would be an inner circle within SEATO, which would essentially be the Western members, and then there would be an outer circle that would include the Asian members of SEATO. So they were very much not interested at all in this proposal that the 4 of them would get together. But then by April 1958, Australia approaches the United States again. And to talk about the possibility of four-power talks between the British, including the British and the ANZUS group. And Eisenhower at this stage doesn't object as long as the discussions don't undermine CETO, and they're also held in the strictest secrecy, because once again, he's extremely concerned about the Asian members of CETO. And he's also still very sensitive about this idea of a Western neo-colonial tag. And he's also concerned about it looking like these four English-speaking members are ganging up and becoming actually a white man's club in Asia. But the US is also very mindful about Australia maintaining their communist tie, not communist, that's a Freudian slip, Commonwealth ties. And they're very concerned that Australia maintains their ties with the UK. The United States is also very concerned that the British maintain their own presence in Southeast Asia defence, in particular the position of the Singapore base, the British base at Singapore. So this is what starts to happen. They start to have secret talks, unofficial talks, informal talks between the four nations on Southeast Asia defence. They get together from time to time. One notable time when they gathered together to have quite serious discussions was the beginning of the confrontation between Indonesia and Malaysia, the Konfrontasi conflict, in which Britain had to send troops to North Borneo because of their defence treaty with Malaysia, the Anglo-Malaysian Defence Treaty, and in which Australia and New Zealand also sent forces. The United States was part of what was quadripartite talks over the beginning of that, also out of concern that they didn't have to be dragged into that conflict, because of course this is also, the confrontation happens just before, a few years before the United States send their military forces to the war in Vietnam. And so that was a very notable incident where the four powers got together unofficially. Meanwhile, in CETO, the Thais and the Filipinos are very much aware that the English-speaking members of CETO are having a little sideline chinwags from time to time, and they're not happy about it. And they become very disillusioned with this. The continuation of informal four-power discussions leads to a British proposal in early 1966 to formalise the arrangement. The United States, once again, is still not interested, but they do not reject this idea of discrete four-power discussions, but they do oppose to joint planning and joint commands, which of course they opposed during CETO as well, which was another issue that the Australians had. And so I think that the point of my presentation that I'm giving today is to look at, while Australia formally entered into a tripartite agreement through the ANZUS Treaty, in which Britain was left out, Australia had no intentions of leaving Britain out of discussions over Southeast Asia defence, and certainly was very keen to maintain it, as were the British as well. One of the big sticking points were the Americans, but they're also playing walking on a little bit of a tightrope, because they also want to maintain Commonwealth input in Southeast Asian defence during this period. That's it. I think that's it, isn't it? Yeah.
Questions? I'll start off with, where does sort of France fit into all of this? Because you were saying with ANZUS that if the British joined, France would have to join, but then France ends up in CETO and doesn't really invest in it and is obviously left out of the four powers discussions.
Yeah, well, it's the United States who's concerned that they would then have to lure in the French. I don't know whether the French would have wanted to be lured in, but of course the French did join CETO. By the early 1960s, the French have lost interest in CETO. And what was the trigger for the French was the crisis in Laos, which almost ended up with, it was probably the Laos crisis with the Pathet Lao, which is the communist forces in Laos, was pretty much the closest that CETO ever got to launching any one of their counterinsurgency plans. CETO had a whole list of plans. Wayne had mentioned a few of them in terms of the nuclear side of it, but there were a number of counterinsurgency plans, and the one relating to Laos, and there was a lot of discussions within CETO about whether CETO actually had launched any military action in Laos against the Pathet Lao. And the French were very much against it, and that was a turning point for the French in CETO, and they quickly started to lose interest. And the Pakistanis had already, by that stage, lost a bit of interest. For the Thais and the Philippines, they started to get concerned, as I said, about the English-speaking nations ganging up, and they started to, lose interest later on down the track.
Thanks, Sue. I had a sort of question about the strategic logic behind having both a CETO and then also an ASEAN in terms of the overlapping interests that the region sort of then created, because they were both, I think, in Glenn's presentation about how it was a preparation for the Cold War and sort of not the hot war. Were there sort of overlapping sort of anti-communist sort of strategic intentions between the two? Because look, obviously one worked out and the other didn't. What was sort of, the strategic logic behind sort of CETO when ASEAN already existed? Or maybe I'm getting the timeline wrong. Sorry, ASEAN and CETO, because they had overlapping sort of regional, yes.
Right, so,
yeah.
Okay, well, ASEAN wasn't formed until 1967, and ASEAN was never a defence organisation, but it's still an important factor because ASEAN is a regional grouping, and it was definitely came out of a product of the Cold War. It was the 5 Southeast Asian nations, the original members to begin with: Singapore, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Indonesia was adamant. Indonesia had always had an independent defence, foreign policy and defence policy, and Indonesia was adamant that ASEAN would not deal with defence. Although that being said, for a lot of nations, and in fact the Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, always said that it was an unspoken assumption that ASEAN would deal with security through the cooperative mechanisms of economic cooperation and political and cultural cooperation. And in fact, ASEAN, if you think, 50 plus years on now, ASEAN is very much, has brought stability within Southeast Asia, certainly. And they've never been a defence. They came close to it in the 1980s when they had quite serious discussions on how to deal with the war between Cambodia and Vietnam and Cambodia, when Vietnam invaded Cambodia in the late 1970s. And so ASEAN doesn't have that strategic element, even though it has the Cold War element. And certainly the Western powers were very supportive of the creation of ASEAN. The United States was very supportive of it, British were too, Australia was as well. But keen not to be seen to be involved in any way. And the 5 founding members of ASEAN, of course, were all non-communist, and so they all had shared strategic interests, whereas CETO was definitely a product of the Geneva Conference. It was the United States' second prong strategy towards Indochina, and the United States didn't sign the Geneva Agreements, and so they weren't obliged to follow the Geneva Agreements. And so they were determined to create a security treaty as an umbrella group for Indochina, very much so. Yet ironically, when the United States finally did send ground troops to the Vietnam War in 1965, it was not through CETO. Because the Laos crisis in 60-61 had caused problems for, within SEATO, as I've mentioned, with the French sort of losing interest quite a bit. And there was also conflicts between the British, the Americans, the Australians and the New Zealanders about force, actually what forces that they would actually give to any SEATO counterinsurgency plans as well. So there was different ideas on just how much commitment, force commitments, there would be. The Menzies declared, I think in 1958, that Australia would earmark forces for SEATO. The Americans never did. The Americans were adamant it wasn't going to be another NATO. And they were very, very cagey about what sort of commitment they would make to SEATO. Yep.
Two-part question. One is kind of an epistemological question as to the lens you're looking through this. So this is the end of a kind of great wars. There's a residue of a great war, great powers sort of playing out. Mountbatten's got the, Wayne talked earlier about Mountbatten's concerns around India, etc. To what extent, what's the conceptual framework that you look through this? And the second part is, to what extent do...
The echo.
Sorry, is that better?
What was the first question?
The first question is, what's the epistemological lens that you're looking through when you're looking at this? Are you thinking in terms of, a dying great powers narrative? Or, how do you think about this rather than just in terms of a descriptual, factual kind of analysis of historical forces? What do you think are the underlying conceptual structures and forces that are driving this, and the insights that you get from that, given your role on the absence of India in this? India was really, to some extent as we go forward, our inability, both Menzies and others, inability to bring India to the solution and to the dynamic that was there continually gets repeated over and over again. And I'm curious as to how you think about this at a more conceptual level. Leaving aside the kind of factual, chronological stuff, what's actually going on here at a conceptual level? The facts are interesting, but unless we can bring them and put them in a conceptual framework, what do we do with the facts?
Oh, that's a bad question to ask a historian. I have to say, what's your conceptual framework, your theoretical framework on this? In terms of, some sort of alliance strategy or,
So maybe what I'm seeing is an end of a great powers narrative, the dying embers of Mountbatten's aspirations for the loss of India, its personal need to find redemption. You can think about great man strategy, you can think about an emerging rules-based order, a liberal democracy, US.
Well, you can't go past the Cold War lens. I suppose rather than saying it's a lens, it's more like the layers. You can't go past the overarching layer of the Cold War. And the United States' big focus is the Cold War. But there are also the regional layers too. And Australia has a slightly different focus. They're focused on the Cold War, but they're also focused on the Cold War in their own neighbourhood. The United States, and in fact I've seen documents, conversations between the Australians and the Americans where the Americans are saying, and very much when it comes to the force commitments and their concerns about being drawn into defending Malaya and defending other parts of Asia, they actually say, but we have global commitments, so we are, we're not necessarily going to be drawn into it. And certainly the United States' position on Asia was not to be drawn in until the turning point for them was the PRC victory in China in 1949 and then the Korean War. And so that was a big turning point for the Americans, but they're still, even in the late 50s, early 60s, they're adamant not wanting to be drawn in. So they do want, and President Johnson said that about Vietnam, we want more flags in Vietnam. So they do want the British still to be in Asia. They do want the United States, Australia and New Zealand to also be involved. So there is the regional layer as well. And then, you do have the issue of Australia's relationship with British and the whole idea of Commonwealth defence and the responsibilities of that. But yeah, in terms of a conceptual framework, maybe I don't. I think I look at it more from the historical, empirical basis, yeah.
We've got two people. If we answer them relatively quickly, we'll fit them in. So Peter first.
Thank you. Sue, thank you very much for your presentation. A short question about the Commonwealth. After the Second World War, the US was very keen for Britain to decolonise and was opposed to empire, and then saw the Commonwealth as a valuable a voluntary association of powers. I just wonder, given the Americans' not enthusiasm, but support for the Commonwealth, to what extent, how do you evaluate the ongoing value of the Commonwealth to the security interests of Australia and the United States in this region? Does the Commonwealth have a future?
The United States wanted very much the continuation of the Commonwealth. They see the Commonwealth links as a good link for the Australians and New Zealanders to remain committed to Southeast Asian security. And in a way, it is a good link for them because they've got their own issues with the British. Very much at the end of the Second World War, the United States are very much in favour of decolonisation, of course. Sorry. Oh, microphone. Sorry. Very much in favour of decolonisation. But they are also extremely in favour of a British commitment to Southeast Asian security. And very key to that is wanting the British to stay in Singapore. And when the British, in 1964, the Wilson government kickstarts a series of defence reviews, which ultimately leads into the British decision to withdraw from their Singapore base, and that is the end of east of Suez, so to speak. The United States puts a lot of pressure on the British to try and get them to stay, and they embark on deals over weapons to give them cheaper equipment to help them out with their balance of payments problems. There's a lot of effort, and so key to that also is having the Australians and the New Zealanders supporting the British to remain in the region too. The British at one stage wanted to move the Singapore base to Darwin, but the Australians were dead against that because they thought if they said yes, the British would just do it immediately and there'd be no more Singapore. And there was also a dispute as to who would pay for it. There's always disputes over who's going to pay for things.
In Vietnam, I think only Australia was the only country to support the United States in the Vietnam War officially. Australia was the only country apart from America fighting the Vietnam War.
No, New Zealand had troops there.
Okay, sorry.
The Philippines had troops there, so did the Thais.
There you go. Right.
Yes, there you go.
Because America was very reluctant in the 50s.
Oh, the South Koreans. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm corrected, that's fine. But they were very reluctant in the 50s to get involved in Southeast Asia, like Malaya and things like that. But if they did get involved in the 50s and supported a bit more of what we were doing, would they have got more support, do you think, of an alliance in Vietnam, having a bigger, more flags fighting in the Vietnam War?
In the 19th, sorry.
So America did get involved in the 50s in Malaysia, for example, when British wanted them to get help out.
I'm now going to confess, the Americans didn't get, they sent ground troops in Vietnam from 65, but prior to that they had a lot of military advisors in South Vietnam. And before that they were supporting the French financially in their war, in what's known as the First Indochina War.
No, that's all right. I'll speak to you later about it. This is confusing.
Pardon?
I'll speak to you later about this. Fine.
Yes, okay.